2 weeks left in the fantasy football regular season. The playoff push begins now. This is the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. What's up, everybody? My name is Steven Andress. On this week's show, we have waiver wire pickups in Pick 'em Up, the stream team streaming options among quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses. And we finish off with stealthy starts for week number 12. As always, be sure to subscribe to our page, like this video, and if you comment below, I'd be happy to answer any of your fantasy football questions for week number 12. Let's begin with Pick 'em Up. These are running backs owned in less than 50% of leagues for week number 12 that I like to pick up and maybe possibly even start for week 12. And the first is Scarbrough of the Detroit Lions. This guy bounced around teams throughout this year, but he looks to have landed safely in Detroit for the rest of the season. Last week, 49% of snaps that led the backfield. He led the Lions as well with 14 touches, 55 yards and a touchdown with those touches. Gets to face Washington this week, allowing 4.6 yards per carry. I think Scarbrough is a decent option not only this week, but for the rest of the season with Kerryon Johnson on injured reserve. Second option, Derrius Guice in the same game for Washington going up against Detroit. Derrius Guice has always had the talent. That hasn't been the issue. The issue has been health. He's finally back healthy now. In that first game back in week 11, yes, less than 30% of the snaps, they eased him back in, but 69 yards on just 8 touches. He added a touchdown. Most of those touches coming in the fourth quarter. And if you look at his upcoming schedule, the next 3 weeks, 3 opponents ranked in the top 8 in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. He's less than 50% owned heading into week 12. I think he's a pretty solid option among waiver wire running backs. Lastly is a Thursday night football option. The Colts backfield is decimated, and I think both Nyheim, Hines, and Jonathan Williams are good desperation options if you're in need of a running back for week number 12. Jordan Wilkins looks to be out with an ankle injury. We already know Marlon Mack is out with a broken hand. That'll leave these two in the backfield against the Texans on Thursday night. Frank Reich has already said Hines' satellite back hybrid role will not change, so he should be getting the majority of the receptions for PPR leagues. But Williams in relief of Mack last week, 14 total touches, most of those were rushing attempts, 147 total yards. It is a tough matchup against the Texans, who have allowed the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs, so I do like the 2 previous running backs I mentioned more than these Colts running backs. But if you're in need, these Colts backups could be a decent option as well. There is a wide receiver I really like this week, but I'm saving him for stealthy starts, so we'll get to him a little bit later on in the show. Let's move on to the stream team. These are quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses owned in less than 50% of leagues that you can pick up and start in week number 12. Beginning with the quarterbacks, Sam Darnold of the New York Jets. Don't look now, but he's starting to heat up a little bit. Back-to-back weeks of 21-plus fantasy points against the Giants in Washington. He gets to take on Oakland in week number 12, who is top 10 in fantasy points allowed to the quarterbacks this year at more than 20 points allowed to QBs this season. Second streaming option, Baker Mayfield of the Cleveland Browns. I know he has been erratic this season, but he gets to face Miami in week number 12. Top 5 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season, allowing 21.4 fantasy points per game to QBs. Mayfield's ownership dipped under 50% this week, so he becomes eligible as a streaming option, and he had 3 touchdowns last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. You could do worse than Baker Mayfield in week number 12. Moving on to streaming tight ends for week 12, Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos has emerged as the second option in the passing attack for Denver, with Brandon Allen at quarterback behind Cortland Sutton, their wide receiver. If you look at his targets over the past 3 weeks, it's promising among tight ends. In week 10, 11 targets. He only had 4 catches for 60 yards, but the opportunity was there. The week before, in week 9, 3 receptions, 115 yards and a touchdown. And in week 8, 9 targets in that one. The first-round rookie out of Iowa is starting to see his role grow ever since the Broncos traded Emmanuel Sanders to the San Francisco 49ers. My next streaming tight end option is Ryan Griffin from the New York Jets. And we all thought Chris Herndon was going to be an option this season in fantasy football. He's on IR now. Ryan Griffin, his backup, has been fantastic in relief. If you look at the numbers over the past 3 games without Herndon, Griffin has put up 4 catches, 66 yards, and 2 touchdowns, 6 catches for 50 yards, and 5 catches for 109 yards and a touchdown. Those are elite fantasy tight end numbers, and Oakland is top 5 in fantasy points allowed to tight ends this season at more than 15 per game. If both of those guys are picked up already, an honorable mention goes out to Jacob Hollister of the Seattle Seahawks, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles this week. Moving on to streaming defenses for Week 12. The first option, the Cleveland Browns at home with 10 days between games, playing Thursday last week, get to take on the Miami Dolphins this time around. Yeah, Myles Garrett will not be there after his boneheaded move last week using a helmet to hit Mason Rudolph in the head. But this defense has looked pretty good in recent weeks, and Miami is still generous to fantasy defenses. The most points allowed to fantasy Ds, in fact, in the NFL this season. Browns last week, 4 sacks, 4 interceptions, only 7 points allowed to Pittsburgh. And again, we mentioned the 10 days between games should give them plenty of opportunity to have a solid game against the Miami Dolphins this week. Next streaming defense option is one that has not been startable for most of this season, but in the past 2 weeks has reemerged as the team we thought they might be in the preseason. The Atlanta Falcons defense has been dominant in the past 2 weeks. In games against the New Orleans Saints and the Carolina Panthers, they have not allowed a single touchdown. This Falcons defense looks much better with Dan Quinn reassigning some of the coaching assignments on defense. The Bucs top 5 in points allowed to fantasy defenses this season. That's who the Falcons get in Week 12 at home. And the Falcons defense the last 2 weeks, in addition to not allowing a touchdown, 11 sacks, 4 total interceptions, and a defensive touchdown. Dan Quinn's team is playing for him in the second half of the season and playing extremely well. All right, Stealthy starts before we wrap up our show for week number 12. We mentioned in Pick 'em Up that there's a wide receiver I like that's owned in less than 50% of leagues. I also would start him this week. Somehow Devante Parker is still owned in less than half of leagues for the Miami Dolphins, and his numbers say he should be owned in a lot more leagues. Since week 4, he has 5+ receptions and 59+ yards or a touchdown in 7 consecutive games. He gets to take on Cleveland on the road this week. From week 4 on, he's the wide receiver 17 in PPR leagues, wide receiver 16 in standard. Last week, 7 receptions, 135 yards on 10 targets. That's now back-to-back weeks with 10 targets, and he gets the Jets, Giants, and Bengals in the fantasy playoffs. As long as Ryan Fitzpatrick is the quarterback, Devante Parker is going to be at least a flex option for the rest of the year and might be a sneaky sleeper in the fantasy playoffs for you as well. Lastly, Jaylen Samuels of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, this name is always contingent on the health of James Conner, but he re-aggravated that shoulder injury last week. So if Conner is out, Samuels becomes a sneaky start this week, taking on Cincinnati on the road. Samuels in week 11, 10 touches in relief of Conner with that first quarter injury, including 5 receptions off the bench. 2 weeks prior, when Conner sat out, 17 and 21 touches respectively for Jaylen Samuels in those games. And Cincinnati, as most of you know, very generous to running backs this season, top 5 in fantasy points allowed to the position. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, be sure to comment below if you have any questions you would like answered for your starting lineup decisions, and best of luck in week number 12.